Now we get to sew the body of the bag, starting with the side slash bottom, which is two pieces that make both sides and the bottom. We want to take them, place them right sides together, sew this bottom seam at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so this bottom seam, and then after you've sewn the bottom seam, you will press both seam allowances to one side, top stitch the seam, and then grade the seam allowance. So we'll be doing this to both the body. For the next several steps, we work both the body and the lining in the same way. So, looking closely at this, we see you can see this line of top stitching that I did, similar to the top stitching that we did on the the pocket inset. Stitching close to the seam allowance. I've stitched about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam allowance and done that with both seam allowances pressed to one side. And the reason we're doing this here is to make the bottom of the bag extra sturdy, that having that line of stitching through the folded over seam allowance gives a lot of extra strength on that seam that might receive a good beating around as you can fill this bag pretty darn full. There's a lot of weight in there. And this will keep it sturdy. And then again, I graded that seam allowance, which means trimming down one side of the seam allowance so that the two seam allowances aren't ending at the exact same point, so that from the right side of the fabric, it's sort of a gradient of fabric instead of one bulky line with them both ending in the same place, and that just makes it less visible where those seam allowances are. So I'm going to go ahead and do this to both the main fabric and the lining fabric. Then after we've done this, we want to take one of either the front or the back, it doesn't matter for getting started, and we're going to pin this lining or side bottom piece, pin it to the main body piece, and that is going to be the first seam that we sew. So we want to start, there's a couple notches to match, so we want to match the notch sort of on the top, and then there is notches at the very bottom that we have sort of on either side of the bottom center, so we want to match those, and I go ahead and then match. There's one more notch to match on the side, and now I can go ahead and sort of put pins to distribute the fabric along the way. I want to make sure that I have the seam allowances, the edges of the fabric meeting the sides. Starting my pins where I have notches to match and kind of working my way from each notch, working towards the center to make sure everything is all lined up. You might find it a little bit tricky pinning around this curve. It is the same length at the seam allowance, which is, again, our 1/2 inch seam allowance. The fabric is the same length all the way around, but it may feel a little different because you have a straight piece of fabric matching up with a curve. And so if you're find that challenging to sew, just insert a bunch more pins. The more pins, the merrier. So I have now this half pinned. I'm going to go ahead and pin the other side, and then we can sew this seam. There's no special trick to sewing the seam. So what we end up with after we sew that seam here is I have the body, this is the back, and this is sewn all the way around. Now what we want to go ahead and do here is, again, we're going to press the seam allowances to one side and top stitch them down. And again, this is all to make everything as sturdy as possible. This will get a little bit challenging when we are completing the second side, but it's really worth it to make this bag last. Like I've said, this, you know, this is a huge bag, so it can hold a lot of stuff, and making these seams as sturdy as possible will help keep the bag together for, you know, we don't have to worry about it when we load it up with stuff. So around the curve, I'm going to go ahead and take some notches out around the curve. And that's going to help it so that when we press the seam allowances in, there will be plenty of relaxation of the seam so that it easily presses. The seam allowance will easily press in. What I'm going to do now, after doing that, is grab an iron, and I want to press the seams toward the lining, or the side, toward the side/bottom. And one way to actually get a really crisp seam to easily press the seam one direction is actually to go in initially and press the seam open, and then after you've pressed the seam open, you can go ahead and then press it to one side. And what that helps you to do is just make sure that you are getting a nice crisp press on this side so that you're actually pressing right on the seam allowance instead of having, you know, maybe your fabric a bit folded or bunched where you're pressing. Pressing it open first allows you just a little bit more precision when you then press it again to one side. So I'm going to go ahead and do that all the way around on this entire seam that I have sewn in. First going in and pressing it open just because I find that makes it a little bit easier, and then pressing it toward the lining side. This gets a tiny bit tricky when you're getting around the corner. It's again why I took notches out, although you could just clip to release that seam. You know, you want to pull, you know, if you can't get it pressed open, it might be a little tight to get it pressed open in around there. So just going to, you know, I'm gently pulling away so that I'm pulling the seam open as I press. Best technique is actually to press a seam. You tend to want to press from the right side of your fabric, and that is sort of the best technique, best practices for getting a seam pressed, is that from the right side of fabric, again, it's a lot easier to make sure that you are pressing the seam open as crisply as you can without accidentally getting a fold in there. But I find that working, trying to press this seam allowance and around this curve, I find it a bit easier to work from the inside of the fabric and then turn it over and make sure it's as crisp as possible, sort of polish that up by pressing from the right side of the fabric again. So I'm gonna go ahead and press that seam, get it sewn on, and get it pressed down all the way around, and then I can go back around and top stitch this seam in place like I've been top stitching the other seams. So sewing on the side/bottom piece of fabric 1/8 of an inch with both seam allowances pointing toward the side/bottom. I wanted to show the top stitching process on the second side just to show that it's really not as hard as it looks. You don't have to worry about manhandling too much, and it really does make a difference in the final sturdiness of your bag. So the way I like to do it is to kind of sew with the fabric, the purse essentially turned inside out, and then get in there, and you'll find that as you sew, it's so big and the opening at the top is so generous that it's really not that hard to sew yourself all the way around this seam. You might want to, pause and rearrange things as you go. So I always sew with my needle stopping in the down position anytime I know I'm going to be pausing and rearranging things on a seam. But you can see, it's so big that it's really not that hard. So you really should go ahead and do this extra step that really gives you the final prettiest and most polished and sturdiest bag. And this is the reason that we went ahead and pressed the seam towards the center beforehand, so we don't have to worry about tucking it in with our hand as we go. It should all be pressed. But as I've said before, if you have a fabric that doesn't take a press very well, and it doesn't feel like or you can't be sure that the seam allowance is actually going towards the side bottom of the bag, you can feel with your hands as you go, or you can stick one hand underneath, and I can feel now the seam allowance. As I'm threading the bag in, I can feel and make sure that the seam allowance is pressed to the left side. Which in my case is towards the side/bottom. It doesn't necessarily have to be the left if you're sewing the other direction. But really, this bag is so generous that you can see there's really not even that much manhandling to get all the way around this seam. And there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and grade the seam allowance, trimming that down, and then the bag body is assembled and we can move on to inserting the zipper.